This is Rummy's Corner.
Marvelous Marvin Hagler got his first opportunity to compete for the middleweight world championship when he challenged the undisputed WBA WBC middleweight champion Vito Antuofermo. It was November 30th, 1979 at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada. Going into that contest, Hagler had already been a highly rated middleweight contender for a number of years. He earned his status as a top-rated contender the hard way. Going into his first title shot, Hagler's professional record consisted of 46 victories with 2 losses and a draw. So before we even get into Hagler's first championship fight, let's quickly review some fights he had prior to this, during his arduous journey that earned him the opportunity to compete for the middleweight world championship. On January 13th, 1976, at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Hagler squared off against Bobby Boogaloo Watts. Watts had been considered a top 10 middleweight for a number of years, and he was a tall, rangy guy with quick hands and a sharp jab. This clash of styles produced a fast-paced, scrappy technical battle where Hagler's skill set was on full display. Hagler was utilizing good elusive upper body movement and stellar footwork as he patiently applied effective pressure. Hagler was working behind a solid jab, he was frequently deflecting and dodging and blocking incoming fire, and he showed an excellent chin whenever Boogaloo Watts tagged him with something flush. Even when the two were tied up in close, Hagler was exhibiting quality infighting skills. Whenever Watts unloaded with a nice combination, Hagler would almost always return the favor with some firepower of his own. At the end of 10 competitive rounds of action, Bobby Boogaloo Watts was awarded a majority decision. This was the first professional loss suffered by Hagler, and it was a somewhat controversial decision. Less than 2 months later, Hagler would suffer another loss at the Spectrum, this time against Willie Monroe. But Hagler rebounded later that year on September 14th when he faced Eugene Cyclone Hart. Cyclone was a tall, powerful Philly middleweight, and Hagler boxed well in this one. It was a battle of maneuvering where Hagler was exhibiting good movement and positioning. He dropped Hart in round 3, and after that, Hagler was in control of the action and was typically getting the best of the exchanges. Hart did not answer the bell to begin round 9, and the fight was over. This was an important win for Hagler at this time. So Hagler finished that year on a strong note, but 1976 was a tough year for the Marvelous One. He lost 2 of 3 fights to begin the year, and finished the year with 5 victories and those 2 defeats. Hagler was a talented boxer who was just beginning to blossom, but he wasn't a huge star, and he represented a high-risk, low-reward proposition, which was why Hagler was frequently competing in the talented rich Philly circuit in the first place, where there was a high concentration of very talented middleweights. But his efforts in Philly left him 1-2 that year. At the conclusion of 1976, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Carlos Monzon was the reigning champion, and Hagler was not yet considered especially consequential in the grand scheme of the middleweight landscape. Hagler got off to a good start the following year when he had a rematch against Willie the Worm Monroe. The Worm defeated Hagler the previous year, but this time Monroe had difficulty coping with Hagler's sheer determination. Monroe battled bravely, but he was being outboxed and outgunned. In the 12th and final round, Hagler landed a right uppercut and a straight left that floored the Worm. Monroe beat the count, and Hagler was relentless with his follow-up attack. Marvelous Marvin battered the Worm mercilessly until referee Tommy Rawson had finally seen enough and called a halt to the contest. It was a 12th round technical knockout for Hagler, and he avenged one of his 2 previous losses and did so in dramatic style. A few months later in August, Marvelous Marvin and Willie the Worm had a rubber match. In round 2, Hagler rocked Monroe with a sizzling left hook as he was switching stances. Monroe grabbed on, and moments later, a savage left-right combo sent Willie down. The Worm made it to his feet, but he was very wobbly, and referee Tommy Reed waved it off. It was a second-round technical knockout from Marvin that put an exclamation point on their rivalry. On November 26, 1977, Hagler squared off against undefeated middleweight contender Mike the Cobra Colbert. At this time, Colbert was the number 1 ranked middleweight according to Ring Magazine. By this point in time, reigning champion Carlos Monzon had retired, and Rodrigo Valdez had defeated Benny Briscoe 3 weeks earlier to win the vacant WBA/WBC middleweight crown. So this was a significant matchup in the middleweight title picture, and it wound up producing an interesting clash of styles. Colbert was a smooth operator with very good skills and excellent footwork. Colbert was trying to glide around the ring with a stick-and-move style where he could quickly land and immediately dart out of harm's way. Hagler was patiently stalking and scoring whenever he could, but whenever he got too close, Colbert would grab on and reset the action. It was a very competitive affair that was tricky to score. At the start of round 12 in their scheduled 15-rounder, Hagler unleashed a vicious attack that sent Colbert down. He beat the count, but Hagler had him down again almost immediately, and this time the Cobra would not beat the count. It was a 12th round knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. At the conclusion of 1977, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Rodrigo Valdez was the undisputed middleweight champion. Hagler was the number 1 ranked contender, and Mike Colbert had dropped down to number 2. But despite being held in such high regard, Hagler would still need to wait for his big chance to fight for the title. In April 1978, Hagler had a dominant effort against Demolition Doug Demings. This one quickly evolved into a one-sided mismatch where Hagler administered a brutal beating on Demings. To his credit, Demings proved to be pretty durable in this one, but he had no answers for Hagler's persistent assaults. Hagler dropped Demings in round 8. Demings beat the count, and Hagler was all over him, landing one clubbing shot after another until the referee had finally decided he had seen enough. It was an 8th round technical knockout for Hagler. On August 24th, 1978, at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Hagler went up against former 3-time title challenger Bad Benny Briscoe. At this time, Hagler was ranked number 8 by both the WBA and WBC, whereas Briscoe was ranked number 5 by the WBA and number 10 by the WBC. So this was a battle between 2 universally ranked middleweights. Hagler showcased his elite-level boxing skills in this one, and he put forth a workmanlike effort. Hagler was using terrific footwork and an outstanding jab to dictate the action. Hagler utilized outstanding movement, and he was putting his punches together with great fluidity. At times, Marvin would switch stances where he was also jabbing effectively. As much as Briscoe tried to lure Hagler into a brawl, Hagler remained disciplined and he held his own whenever the two scrapped in close. Later in the fight, the two were battling in close quarters more often, and Marvelous Marvin was typically outmaneuvering and outworking Bad Benny. At the conclusion of 10 rounds, Hagler was awarded a unanimous decision. This was a big win for Hagler. At the conclusion of 1978, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Hugo Coro was the undisputed middleweight champion, and Hagler was still viewed as the number 1 middleweight contender according to the publication, and Vito Antuofermo was their number 2 middleweight contender. In February 1979, Hagler had his 3rd bout against Sugar Ray Seales. Hagler won a 10-round unanimous decision against Seals back when they were both undefeated middleweight prospects in August 1974. And in November of that year, they fought to a controversial 10-round majority draw. But this time, Hagler tore him apart, dropping him 3 times before the fight was stopped after just 86 seconds. In June 1979, Hagler faced Norberto Cabrera. Hagler dominated the fight and methodically outboxed Cabrera with smarts and precision, along with showing an iron chin. In round 8, Hagler started battering Cabrera with several barrages and he was absorbing a real beating, which prompted his corner to throw in the towel. This led to Hagler finally getting his title shot when he challenged Antuofermo for the undisputed middleweight crown, a distinction that Antuofermo had earned when he was awarded a razor-thin 15-round split decision against Hugo Coro. Hagler was boxing beautifully in the earlier rounds. Antuofermo was having his best moments whenever he was able to trade in close. But for the most part, Hagler controlled the first half of the contest by boxing intelligently and maintaining space. But Vito began fighting his type of fight during the second half of the contest, where he was able to crowd Hagler inside more effectively. Antuofermo was a tricky operator fighting in close, and things were generally much more competitive later in the fight. But Hagler was still quite capable of battling inside a phone booth. And Hagler still maintained a clear advantage whenever he had some space. But down the final stretch in the championship rounds, things had evolved into an all-out brawl with a lot of heated toe-to-toe action, and Hagler was generally landing cleaner and harder to close things out. At the conclusion of 15 rounds, the fight was ruled a draw, and Antuofermo retained his title. This was a controversial decision that most observers believed Hagler deserved to win. At the conclusion of 1979, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Antuofermo was still the reigning undisputed middleweight world champion, and Hagler maintained his spot as their number 1 contender. But the draw against Antuofermo was a huge setback for Marvin's championship aspirations. Hagler was unable to secure an immediate rematch, and Antuofermo would instead defend his titles against Alan Minter, who at that time was the number 1 ranked contender by the WBC and the number 2 ranked by the WBA. Hagler was the WBA number 1, so Hagler went back to prove himself, and he would square off against Lucif Hamani in February 1980. Hamani was ranked number 6 by Ring at this time, and number 5 by the WBC. Hamani was a slick boxer who utilized good speed and movement. Hagler hurt Hamani in round 2, and cool as an assassin, Hagler followed up and unloaded a vicious assault that sent Hamani through the ropes. The fight was over, and in his first bout after the controversial draw against Antuofermo, Hagler made a huge statement in the middleweight division. Meanwhile, the following month in March, Antuofermo would lose the middleweight championship when he dropped a controversial 15-round split decision against Alan Minter. In April, Hagler was originally scheduled to face Marcos Geraldo, who withdrew from the fight the week before. As a late replacement, Hagler would face his former conqueror, Bobby Boogaloo Watts. Watts was the first man to defeat Hagler as a professional, and this was one of the only blemishes left on his record that had not been avenged. The other, of course, being the draw with Antuofermo. At this point in time, Hagler and Watts were on diverging paths, and it showed. Hagler dropped Watts hard in round 2. Boogaloo beat the count, and he started bravely trading with Hagler the best he could. But Hagler was relentless. Just as round 2 was about to end, Hagler landed a booming right hand that dropped Watts again. Watts tried to rise, but he sank back down and the referee waved it off. A month later in May, Hagler faced a man he had previously been scheduled to face, Marcos Geraldo. At that time, Geraldo was ranked number 5 by the WBC and was also recognized as the Mexican middleweight champion. To his credit, Geraldo fought a very smart fight, largely due to his excellent understanding of range. Things were extremely competitive over the first half of the contest, where this tactical chess match was frequently being interrupted by brawling exchanges. Each boxer was trying to outthink the other, and both changed stances a few times throughout the contest. But Hagler was the one generally landing harder. During the later rounds, Hagler was consistently either outboxing Geraldo or outslugging him, and Marvin started landing some nice clubbing shots. At the end of 10 rounds, Hagler was awarded a unanimous decision. In June, Alan Minter retained his title in the first defense of his undisputed middleweight championship in an immediate rematch against Antuofermo. This time, Minter left no doubts as he put forth a solid performance, and the fight was ultimately stopped after the 8th round because of a number of cuts suffered by Antuofermo, and this helped set the big stage for a big middleweight showdown. On September 27, 1980, at Wembley Arena in London, England, Marvelous Marvin Hagler got his second opportunity to fight for the title when he challenged undisputed WBA, WBC middleweight world champion Alan Minter. Interestingly enough, this was the only division in all of boxing that had an undisputed world champion at this time. Both of these southpaws were trying to work the jab, and they were each using it to try and create bigger punching opportunities. They both clubbed away at one another in close, and Hagler soon started finding the mark with some sneaky right hooks and tricky straight lefts. There were some major fireworks in the early rounds, and Hagler was almost always getting the best of the exchanges, and he was consistently landing heavier. In round 3, Hagler landed a pair of powerful leaping rights, and Minter appeared to be in some serious trouble. Hagler was attacking relentlessly, and he was chasing Minter all over the ring. Referee Carlos Berricol stopped the action so the ringside physician could examine Minter's eye, and the fight was stopped. Marvelous Marvin Hagler had just become the new, undisputed WBA, WBC middleweight champion of the world. But unfortunately, Hagler's crowning triumphant victory was overshadowed by an ugly incident when fans started throwing bottles and debris, denying Marvin of his rightful celebratory moment under the big spotlight. At the conclusion of 1980, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Marvelous Marvin Hagler was the reigning middleweight champion. His long and arduous journey to become a world champion had finally been fulfilled, and now Marvin had the chance to prove himself and carve his legacy by defending that title against the best available middleweight contenders. On January 17, 1981, at the Boston Garden in Boston, Massachusetts, Hagler made the first defense of his undisputed middleweight crown when he squared off against undefeated challenger Fulgencio Obel Mejias. Fulio Bell was the number 1 ranked middleweight contender by both the WBA and WBC. The two boxed on fairly even terms over the first few rounds, where Hagler had a slight edge because he was throwing more combinations. In round 4, Hagler started opening up more and he was landing some hard clubbing shots that rocked Obel. Hagler continued battering Obel in the 5th, and early in the 6th, Hagler dropped him with a spirited barrage that was punctuated by a left hook. Obel beat the count and bravely battled, but Hagler was unloading on him with a wide variety of mean punches. Obel was absorbing a tremendous beating over the next few rounds. Early in round 8, Hagler rocked Fulio Bell again, and referee Octavio Moran had seen enough. The fight was over, and it was an 8th round technical knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. On June 13, 1981, at the Boston Garden in Boston, Massachusetts, Hagler made the second defense of his undisputed middleweight crown when he had a rematch against former champion Vito Antuofermo. This time the roles were reversed with Vito in the role of the challenger. Less than a minute into the fight, a clash of heads caused a cut on Antuofermo's hairline. Hagler was firing off a snappy jab and he held an advantage in the opening round. Prior to the start of round 2, it looked as if the fight was over, and there was a lot of confusion in Vito's corner where his cut man Freddie Brown and trainer Panama Lewis were going wild and yelling at referee Davey Pearl, claiming the fight should be ruled a technical draw. Pearl disagreed, and when action finally resumed, Vito was trying his best, but Hagler was literally carving him up. Hagler opened up a cut under Vito's left eye in round 2, and in round 3, Hagler dropped Antuofermo with a beautifully timed short left. He quickly beat the count, and Marvin continued taking care of business. Marvin was consistently beating Vito to the punch, and by round 4, Antuofermo had a cut around his other eye, and his face was very swollen and puffy. After round 4, Antuofermo's corner stopped the fight, and it was a 4th round technical knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. On October 3, 1981, at the Rosemont Horizon in Rosemont, Illinois, Hagler made the 3rd defense of his undisputed middleweight crown when he faced the number 1 ranked middleweight contender Mustafa Hamsho. Hagler controlled the early rounds by boxing behind a sharp right jab. Both boxers suffered cuts in round 3, and Hagler continued boxing effectively, and Hamsho was trying his best to turn the fight into a brawl. Over the next several rounds, Hamsho was sometimes effective when he was able to break Hagler's rhythm, but Hagler was like a surgeon in the ring, and he was sticking Hamsho in the face with his right, and sometimes putting his punches together in short combinations. Hamsho remained tough and determined, but Hagler was simply boxing beautifully. Hamsho showed tremendous heart and durability, but he was being badly outclassed. Hagler continued dissecting Hamsho with surgical-like precision. In round 11, Hagler unleashed a wicked series of punches that prompted Hamsho's corner to throw in the towel. The fight was over. It was an 11th round technical knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. At the conclusion of 1981, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Marvelous Marvin Hagler was still the undisputed middleweight world champion. On March 7, 1982, at Bally's Park Place in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Hagler made the 4th defense of his undisputed middleweight crown when he faced William Caveman Lee. Caveman was a late replacement for Mickey Goodwin. Lee was ranked number 5 by the WBA and number 10 by the WBC. Hagler dropped Lee early in round 1. He beat the count, but Hagler was all over him, and referee Larry Hazard had seen enough. The fight lasted just 67 seconds, and Marvelous Marvin Hagler was the winner by 1st round technical knockout. A month later, Hagler legally changed his name to Marvelous Marvin Hagler, in large part because he was perturbed that the commentators dropped his moniker while doing the broadcast in his victory against Caveman Lee. On October 30th, 1982, at the Ariston Theater in San Remo, Italy, Hagler made the 5th defense of his undisputed middleweight crown when he had a rematch against Fulgencio Obelmajias. Since losing to Hagler, Obel won 8 consecutive fights, all of them inside the distance. This propelled him back into contention where he was the WBA number 1 mandatory contender. Hagler got off to a slow start in this one, and Obel was having some success during the early rounds. But before long, Hagler started finding his groove and establishing a better rhythm. Hagler started building a little momentum, and in round 5, Hagler leveled the challenger with a wrecking ball right. Obel tried to get up, but he stumbled back down, and referee Ernesto Magana waved it off. It was a 5th round technical knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. In November 1982, Sugar Ray Leonard invited Hagler to a charity event where Leonard was set to announce whether he would continue with his boxing career. The general expectation was that this would be the official announcement of a mega bout between Leonard and Hagler. Instead, Leonard trolled Hagler and announced his retirement. At the conclusion of 1982, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring magazine. Hagler was still the reigning middleweight world champion. On February 11, 1983, at the Centrum in Worcester, Massachusetts, Hagler made the sixth defense of his undisputed middleweight crown when he squared off against Tony Simpson. Tony was the WBC number 1 ranked middleweight mandatory contender. Hagler seized command early and never looked back. Marvin was using excellent movement and he controlled the range with a snappy jab. Hagler was landing a lot of sharp short combinations as he boxed at a measured pace. To his credit, Simpson kept trying to close the distance and press his attack, but Hagler was too slick and too smart. Simpson was receiving an advanced degree boxing lesson from Professor Marvin. Both boxers traded furiously in round 6, and Hagler got the best of the exchange and he sent Simpson down. He beat the count, but before long, the two traded once more and again Hagler won the exchange with superior firepower. Simpson was down, he again beat the count, but he was very wobbly and referee Carlos Padilla had seen enough. It was a 6th round technical knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. On May 27, 1983, at the Civic Center in Providence, Rhode Island, Hagler squared off against Wilfred Scypion for the newly formed vacant IBF middleweight title. Scypion was the number 1 ranked middleweight according to the WBC, and he was the number 2 ranked middleweight according to the WBA. But strangely enough, neither alphabet body actually sanctioned the bout. The WBA and WBC both still recognized Hagler as their respective champion, but if Hagler were to lose, both alphabet bodies declared their versions of the middleweight title would become vacant. Scypion was trying his best to crowd Hagler, and he was having some success when he was able to negate the space. But Hagler was often able to outmaneuver Scypion, and whenever Hagler had room to operate, he was decisively outboxing the challenger. In round 4, Hagler unloaded a filthy flurry of punches that sent Scypion down. Scypion was counted out, and Hagler was the winner by 4th round knockout. Meanwhile, a month later, Roberto Duran had re-established himself when he scored an 8th round technical knockout against Davey Moore to win the WBA Junior Middleweight Championship. And this set the stage. On November 10, 1983, at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada, Hagler made his 8th defense when he put his undisputed middleweight crown on the line against former 3-division world champion Roberto Duran. This was a tactical engagement with a lot of feinting, a lot of movement, and a lot of mutual respect on display. Hagler and Duran were both boxing patiently in hopes the other man would take the initiative. But since both boxers were primarily looking to create countering opportunities, there was a lot of posturing and a lot of maneuvering. Sometimes they traded whenever they found themselves in close, but both boxers were still generally embracing tactics that sought to create counterpunching openings. Hagler's superior strength enabled him to start consistently working better during the middle rounds of the contest, where he was putting his punches together exceptionally well whenever the two were in close quarters. But Hagler never pressed the issue, and was otherwise content as he continued patiently boxing and looking to counter. Hagler continued fighting well on the inside, but there was no sense of urgency whenever there was more space separating the two. Hagler remained measured and conservative with his methodical approach, and this enabled Duran to start working his way back. At times, Duran was boxing beautifully on both offense and defense, but Hagler regained control late and he finished the fight strong. Hagler wore Duran down with sheer physicality, but to his credit, Roberto endured everything Hagler threw at him. At the conclusion of 15 competitive rounds, Marvelous Marvin Hagler was awarded a unanimous decision, where the final cards appeared much closer than the action otherwise suggested. At the conclusion of 1983, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Hagler was the reigning undisputed middleweight world champion, and Mustafa Hamsho had rebounded since his loss to Hagler, and was considered the top middleweight contender according to the publication. On March 30th, 1984, at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada, Hagler made the 9th title defense when he put his undisputed middleweight crown on the line against Juan Domingo Roldan. Roldan was the WBA #1 middleweight contender, and he dropped Hagler in the opening seconds of the fight. Hagler was none too happy that this was ruled a knockdown, but Hagler appeared flustered, and Roldan was effectively attacking the champion. Roldan was bringing the heat, and he was not allowing Hagler to discover a comfortable rhythm. Hagler wanted to box, but Roldan was making him fight. Roldan was making a good account of himself. And then near the end of round 3, Hagler scored an official knockdown when Roldan crashed down halfway through the ropes. Over the next few rounds, Hagler started consistently getting off first, as he began fighting fire with measured firepower of his own. Roldan was still fighting well in spots, but Hagler was putting his punches together with exceptional style, and he was throwing with ill intent. Hagler was steadily breaking Roldan down, and by the midway point of the scheduled 15-rounder, Roldan's right eye was swollen shut. In round 10, Hagler landed a sweet combination that dropped the challenger. Roldan beat the count and then informed referee Tony Perez that he did not wish to continue. The fight was over, and it was a 10th round technical knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Meanwhile, in June 1984, Thomas Hearns scored a devastating second-round technical knockout against former Hagler challenger Roberto Duran. On October 19, 1984, at Madison Square Garden in New York, Hagler made his 10th defense when he put his undisputed middleweight crown on the line in a rematch against Mustafa Hamsho. Since losing their first fight, Hamsho had won 6 fights in a row and was the universally ranked #1 middleweight contender by the WBA, the WBC, and also the IBF. This one started as a tactical fight and had a lot of explosive exchanges. Hamsho nailed Hagler with a battering ram headbutt in round 1, but the referee didn't see it. Hagler didn't like this, and early in round 3, Hamsho did the same thing again, and this time he was warned by Arthur Mercanti. Marvin Hagler again did not look happy. Hagler dropped Hamsho halfway through the round. He made it to his feet, but not for long. Hagler started tearing him up, and while Hamsho tried his best, Hagler landed a couple of menacing right hooks that sent Hamsho down again. Hamsho's corner stepped in and the fight was over. It was a 3rd-round technical knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. At the conclusion of 1984, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Hagler was still the reigning middleweight world champion, and according to Ring Magazine, Thomas Hearns was the #1 contender to the throne. A fight between Hagler and Hearns had actually been scheduled to take place on May 24th, 1982, but the fight was postponed because of an injury. Subsequent efforts to reschedule resulted in a breakdown of negotiations, but fortunately for boxing fans, this one would soon come together in an absolute battle for the ages. On April 15th, 1985, at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada, Hagler made his 11th title defense when he put the undisputed middleweight crown on the line against 2-division world champion Tommy the Hitman Hearns. Right out of the gate, a war erupted in the opening seconds of the opening round, and the intensity remained sky high for as long as it lasted. The first round was ridiculously action-packed from start to finish, and it included a great abundance of fireworks where Hagler and Hearns traded furiously. In round 2, Hearns was bouncing around and using a lot of movement to try to keep things at long range, and he was having some success keeping Hagler on the outside. Hearns was doing a good job sticking and moving, but Hagler was still finding his range and landing some isolated hurtful shots. The trend of Hearns boxing from range and Hagler stalking continued into the third round. The referee briefly halted the action so a doctor could examine a cut on Hagler's eye, and when action resumed, the Marvelous One had a renewed sense of heightened urgency. Hagler bulled his way inside and nailed Hearns with a right that left him stumbling. Tommy smiled at Marvin, and Hagler charged right after him. Another big right sent Hearns timbering down, and he was badly hurt. Hearns slowly but bravely rose to his feet, but Richard Steele didn't like what he saw, and he called a halt to the contest. It was a third-round technical knockout for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. At the conclusion of 1985, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring magazine. Hagler was the reigning undisputed middleweight champion, and his number one contender according to Ring was the undefeated John Mugabe, who was 25-0 with all 25 victories coming inside the distance. On March 10, 1986, at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada, Hagler made his 12th title defense when he put his undisputed middleweight crown on the line against John the Beast Mugabe. Hagler started this one fighting out of an orthodox stance. After a feeling out process, Mugabe was the one who started landing clean. After a couple of rounds, Mugabe and Hagler were bombing away at one another to both the head and the body. Marvelous Marvin and the Beast were both absorbing incoming fire just as well as each dished it out. The match soon evolved into a tactical slugfest with a lot of explosive moments. At times, the two engaged in a battle of jabs, where Hagler usually had an advantage. But every so often, one of them would unload with a fiery short combination. There were a lot of fireworks during the middle portions of the contest, and the tremendous assault from Hagler began taking its toll on the challenger. It was an action-packed encounter where Hagler's superior technical skills usually provided him with an advantage. Later in the match, Hagler began landing a lot of short, chopping, punishing shots, and the accumulation of punishment broke the Beast down. By the 11th, Mugabe was in retreat mode, and Marvin pressed his attack. A series of big clubbing shots from the champion wobbled and dropped and exhausted Mugabe. Mugabe was down, and he would not be beating the count. It was an 11th round knockout victory for Marvelous Marvin Hagler. At the conclusion of 1986, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring magazine. Hagler was still the reigning undisputed middleweight champion. Thomas Hearns had returned to the number one contender spot according to Ring, but a rematch between Hagler and Hearns wasn't in the cards. Instead, Hagler would square off against the Hitman's former conqueror. On April 6, 1987, at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada, Hagler put his WBC middleweight championship on the line against former two-division world champion Sugar Ray Leonard. The WBA had stripped Hagler for not facing their number one mandatory Harold Graham, and the IBF refused to sanction this bout. Leonard got off to a fast start, as Hagler spent a large portion of the earlier rounds fighting orthodox. Leonard was dancing around on the outside and using a lot of movement as he fired off jabs and some quick combos. Hagler was trying to close the distance, but Ray was sneaky with his offense and he was keeping Marvin at range and sometimes off balance. During the middle rounds, Marvin was doing a much better job cutting off the ring and closing the gap. Hagler was often able to pin Leonard up against the ropes. Hagler was doing some of his best work whenever he had Ray pinned, but Leonard often fired back off the ropes with some good fast work of his own. Things were close and competitive in the later portions of the fight, where each boxer was scoring effectively. Leonard was trying to keep Hagler in the center of the ring, and Hagler was looking to crowd him and get inside. At the conclusion of 12 rounds, Sugar Ray Leonard was awarded a 12-round split decision, making him a 3-division world champion. This was a somewhat controversial decision that is still hotly debated to this day. Hagler requested a rematch, but Leonard retired again the following month. At the conclusion of 1987, these were the top-rated middleweights according to Ring Magazine. The titles were splintered. Tommy Hearns was the WBC champion, Frank Tate held the IBF belt, and Sumbo Kalambe was the WBA titleist. The ring championship was vacant, and the Hagler era was officially over. Unable to secure a rematch with Leonard, Marvelous Marvin Hagler officially retired from professional boxing in June of 1988. The following month, Sugar Ray Leonard announced he would be returning to boxing to face Donnie Lalonde. Leonard beat Lalonde, and he would go on to have a draw in his rematch against Tommy Hearns, and he won a lopsided decision in his rubber match against Roberto Duran. In 1990, Leonard did offer Hagler a rematch, but Hagler had already moved on and declined the offer. By this point in his life, Hagler was making Italian action movies, like Indio and Indio 2, where even though he was retired from boxing, Hagler was still kicking major ass on the big screen. During the long, rich history of middleweight boxing, Marvelous Marvin Hagler was undoubtedly one of the very greatest middleweights of all time, where indeed many fans, myself included, view Hagler as the greatest middleweight of them all. Thanks for all of the marvelous memories, Marvin, and thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and have a great night, everyone. This is Rummy's Corner.